Call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in late October. I remember because I just turned off the kettle and was about to pour my tea when my phone lit up on the counter. My daughter's name. And underneath, in that small gray font, the word video. She never video called me at night. Not once in 3 years. So before I even slid my thumb across the screen, I knew something was wrong. She was sitting in her car. I could tell from the way the dashboard glowed up under her chin and the sound of the rain hammering on the roof. Behind her in the car seat, I could see my granddaughter's little shoe poking out, those pink rubber soles I bought her at the Bay last Christmas. My daughter's face was wet, but not from crying. Not yet. She'd been out in the rain. "Mum," she said. And then nothing. I asked her where she was. She told me she was at the Esso station off the 401, the one just past Belleville, where we used to stop for coffee on the drive back from her grandmother's. She'd been driving for an hour, she said, and she didn't know where else to go. The baby was asleep. She'd run out of the house with one duffel bag and her purse and the diaper bag. That was it. I asked her what happened, and she told me. Her father-in-law had fired her that morning. Walked into her office at 9:15, told her HR had already processed her termination, that her keycard was deactivated, and that she had 20 minutes to clear her desk. No reason given, no severance paperwork. She'd been the office manager at his engineering firm for 4 years. Then she drove home, sat in the driveway crying, eventually went inside to make lunch for the baby. At 6 p.m., her husband came home, didn't say a word to her, ate his dinner, watched the hockey game. At 9, he told her he was going for a drive. He left. She put the baby down. At 10:30, she realized her key wouldn't work in the front door. She went around to the back. That one didn't work either. The garage code had been changed. She stood there in the wet grass, holding her phone, trying to call him, and his phone went straight to voicemail every time. She'd packed the bag through her bedroom window. She knew how to jimmy it open because she'd done it once in high school when she got locked out. She got the baby through the window first, then climbed through herself. Took what she could, got in the car, drove east on the highway because that was the direction of me. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt once. I learned a long time ago that when my daughter is in shock, she needs to get the whole story out before she can start crying. And if you interrupt her, she just shuts down. So I waited. Then I said, "Sweetheart, listen to me very carefully. I want you to get back on the highway and drive to my house. Don't stop again. Don't answer the phone if he calls. I'll be waiting at the door." She nodded. She was 29 years old, and she nodded like a 6-year-old. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. The kettle had gone cold. Outside, the wind was pulling the last of the leaves off the maple in the yard. I poured the water down the drain, put the kettle back on, and went upstairs to make up the spare room. While I was changing the pillowcases, I thought about my son-in-law's father, a big, florid man named Howard, 63 years old, who liked to talk loudly at family dinners about how he built his business from nothing. How he'd come over from Glasgow in 1979 with 2 suitcases and a trade certificate. How nobody had ever given him anything. How he had 3 offices across southern Ontario now, 52 employees, a cottage on Stony Lake, and a Mercedes he bought cash. He liked to look at me when he said all this. My late husband's pension, my small bungalow in Whitby, my Marks & Spencer cardigans, and I could see him calculating. He thought I was a sweet old widow. He thought I was somebody's mother. He'd never asked me a single question about my own work in the 8 years our children had been together. Not one. I sat down on the edge of the bed and put my hands flat on my knees. I am 67 years old. I retired from active practice at 63. Before that, for 31 years, I was a corporate solicitor at a firm in Toronto that you've heard of, even if you don't think you have. I specialized in commercial real estate and structured ownership, trusts, holding companies, the dull, quiet, lucrative work of moving assets around so they sit somewhere they can't be easily disturbed. I made partner at 39. I retire comfortable. I never talked about it at family dinners because I never felt the need to. My late husband used to laugh about it. He'd say, "Howard thinks you teach piano." And I'd say, let him. But there was something else Howard didn't know. Something my daughter didn't know either. Something I had been holding for almost 5 years, since just after my husband died, because the timing had never been right to bring it up. 6 years ago, when my daughter and her then fiancé were planning the wedding, Howard had come to me with a proposition. He said he wanted to set the kids up. He wanted to buy them a house. But, he said, with the way property prices were in the GTA and with some tax considerations of his own, he wanted to structure it cleverly. He proposed that I put up some of the capital, he'd put up the rest, and we'd hold the property through a numbered company with the two of us as directors. The kids would live there. Eventually, he said, we'd transfer it to them as a wedding gift down the road. He came to me because he assumed I was a widow with a small inheritance and an underused HELOC, and that he could push me into whatever paperwork he wanted. He had no idea what he was doing. He'd downloaded a template from somewhere. The numbered company he'd already incorporated was a mess. The director resolutions were unsigned. The shareholder structure was upside down. And the way he'd drafted the buyout clauses in the event of a marital breakdown would have heavily favored his son. I told him I'd think about it. Then I went home, and over the course of the next 3 weeks, very quietly, I restructured the entire thing. I had a colleague at my old firm help me draft new documents. I made the company a proper numbered Ontario corporation with a clean cap table. I made myself the majority shareholder, 67%. I made Howard 33%. I made myself the sole director. I drafted unanimous shareholder agreements with very specific dissolution clauses. I made the property's title held by the corporation and not by him personally. And then I sent the whole package back to Howard with a note saying, "These are cleaner. My solicitor put them together as a favor. Sign where the tabs are." He signed. He didn't read it. He signed everything I sent him every quarter for the next 5 years, including the supplementary loan agreements that, over time, also moved his cottage's adjacent lot into the same holding structure as collateral for a vendor take-back arrangement I'd helped him with when he'd had a cash crunch in 2023. By the time my daughter called me from that SO station, I owned 67% of a numbered Ontario corporation that owned my daughter's house outright. I had a registered first mortgage in my name against Howard's cottage adjacent lot. I had documented loans payable from Howard to me, totaling just over $410,000, none of which he'd serviced in 18 months because I'd never asked. And sitting in my filing cabinet downstairs in the basement, I had the original signed shareholder agreement that made it explicit, in plain English, that I held the controlling decision on any disposition or use of the property at 47 Linden Crescent in Pickering, the house Howard's son had changed the locks on. She arrived at 1:40 in the morning. I'd been watching the headlights at the end of the street for an hour. When her car pulled into the driveway, I went out in my dressing gown and bare feet. I didn't care about the cold. I opened the back door and unbuckled my granddaughter, who was still asleep, that warm, boneless way that babies sleep. I carried her into the house. My daughter followed me with the bag. We didn't say anything until the baby was tucked into the travel cot I'd set up in the spare room. Then, in the hallway, my daughter put her arms around me and started crying. Not the polite crying she did at her father's funeral. The other kind. The kind that comes from your chest. I held her. I told her she was safe. I told her we'd sort it out. I told her he'd sort it out. I told her I loved her. I did not tell her that first night what I was about to do. I let her sleep until almost noon the next day. When she came downstairs, I had eggs and toast ready, and the kettle on and a yellow legal pad on the kitchen table. She looked at the legal pad. I gestured for her to sit down. "Tell me everything you know about the firm's payroll," I said. She blinked. "What? The firm? Your father-in-law's firm. You were the office manager. Tell me how the payroll runs. Who processes it? What service? What service?" "Everything you can remember." She started talking, slowly at first, then faster. I took notes. I asked her about the lease arrangements on his 3 offices. I asked her about the firm's banking. I asked her about her own credit. Specifically, I asked her whether she had ever at any point given her father-in-law her SIN number or her driver's license for any reason. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "Once, when I started working there." He said HR needed it for the file, but he handled it himself, not HR. "Did you ever check your credit report?" I asked her. She hadn't. Most people don't. I sent her into the living room with my laptop and the Equifax website, and I told her to pull her file. While she was doing that, I made another pot of tea. 20 minutes later, she came back into the kitchen and her face was different. "Mom," she said. There were 2 credit cards she didn't know existed. There was a personal line of credit at a credit union in Oshawa she had never set foot in. There was a car loan in her name for a 2024 Audi Q5 that she had never seen, let alone driven. The total exposure on her credit file in her name was just over $86,000. All of it current. All of it being paid down every month by automatic withdrawal from an account she'd never opened. She sat down very slowly across from me at the kitchen table. "He's been using my SIN, she said. "Yes," I said. "Mom, that's identity theft. That's a criminal." "Yes," I said. "It is," she stared at me. Then she said, "You don't seem surprised." I said, "Sweetheart, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all." I sat down with her. I told her everything. About the conversation Howard had had with me 6 years ago, about the corporate restructuring he'd signed without reading, about the cottage lot and the loans, about the fact that her house, the house she had been thrown out of the night before, was legally owned by a corporation in which I held a controlling interest, and that her father-in-law's signature on the operating agreement legally barred either him or his son from changing the locks, transferring possession, or in any other way restricting her access without unanimous shareholder consent, which they did not have, which they could not get, because I was the only other shareholder and I had not consented. I had also, I told her on a Sunday afternoon 4 years ago when she'd come over for dinner with the baby in her belly, gotten her to sign a few documents that I'd told her were just some grandmother trust paperwork. Those documents had, among other things, made her a 5% beneficiary of the corporate trust that held her house, which meant she had standing, which meant we could act not only as her mother and her lawyer, but as her co-owner. She was very quiet. Then she said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed to know if he would behave." He didn't behave. She thought about this. She is a smart woman. She is, in fact, much smarter than her husband, which is one of the reasons her father-in-law had fired her. She had been getting too close to numbers he didn't want her seeing. She said, "What do we do?" I said, "We have lunch. Then I'm going to make some phone calls." I made 3 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to my former colleague at the firm, the one who had helped me draft the original documents. I told her I needed her to clear her Thursday and Friday and that I'd be couriering her a file. The second was to a private investigator in Toronto I'd used twice during my working life, a very quiet woman named Mrs. Pelletier who had retired from the OPP and who specialized in document authentication and financial paper trails. I asked her to put together a complete picture of the firm's payroll arrangements, the banking, and any directorships Howard held that he might have used to layer the borrowing under my daughter's name. The third was to an officer at the Financial Crimes Unit of a regional police service I had worked with on a file in 2019. I didn't ask him to do anything yet. I just told him I might have something for him in a week or 2, and could he please not be on holiday. Then I made dinner because my granddaughter needed feeding, and grandmothers feed babies regardless of what else is happening in the world. My son-in-law tried to call my daughter 41 times over the next 3 days. We didn't answer. On the 4th day, Howard himself called my landline, which surprised me because I hadn't realized he had the number. He was using his concerned grandfather voice. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said his son was in a state. He said my daughter was welcome to come home and that we could all sit down like adults and sort this out. He said the firing had been a procedural matter and that of course she'd be reinstated. I let him talk. I'd put him on speakerphone so my daughter could hear. She sat at the table with her hands flat against the wood, her face perfectly still. When he finished, I said, "Howard, thank you for calling. I have just one question for you." He said, "Of course." I said, "When did you start using my daughter's social insurance number to take out lines of credit in her name?" There was a long silence. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "Yes, you do. I have her credit report in front of me. There are 6 accounts she did not open. There is a vehicle loan for an Audi I assume your son is driving. There is a credit union line in Oshawa. I assume you used to bridge a cash flow issue around the time of the cottage refinancing. I have her file with me. I have her signed affidavit. And I have a contact at the Financial Crimes Unit who is expecting my call." He said, "Now, let's not get." I said, "Howard, you should also know that the home at 47 Linden Crescent is owned by a numbered Ontario corporation in which I am the majority shareholder and the sole director. You signed those documents in 2020 and again in 2022 and again in 2024. The operating agreement requires unanimous shareholder consent for any change in possession or access. You did not have my consent to change the locks. You did not have my daughter's consent. As of this moment, your son is in unlawful possession of corporate property, and you facilitated it." There was a sound on the other end of the line. It was small, but it was real. It was the sound of a man sitting down. I said, "I'm going to give you a choice. We can do this loudly, and you can lose everything you have, and you can possibly face charges, and your son can possibly face charges. Or we can do this quietly, and you can sign some new paperwork by Friday, and we can settle the matter privately." He said, "What paperwork?" I said. "I'll have it couriered to you tomorrow. Read it this time." I hung up. My daughter looked at me. She said, "Mom." I said, "I know." She said, "I know." She said, "I didn't. I had no idea I didn't." I said, "I know, sweetheart. I never wanted you to need to know." The paperwork I had couriered to Howard the next morning was 16 pages long. It transferred his 33% of the holding corporation to my daughter at par value. It assigned the existing $410,000 in loans payable to me to be forgiven only on completion of all transfers. It required him to make full restitution on the fraudulently obtained credit accounts in my daughter's name and to cooperate fully with the credit bureaus to expunge the accounts from her file. It required a separation agreement to be drafted between my daughter and his son on terms I had already roughed out, terms which were, frankly, generous to his son, considering what we could have demanded. And it required him to terminate his son's employment at the firm with severance, because frankly, I didn't think my daughter needed her ex-husband in the same building as her ever again. His mother-in-law called me on Thursday. I should mention her. Her name is Marjorie. I had always quite liked her. She was a hairdresser who had married Howard when she was 19 and had spent 44 years smiling at his stories. She was, I had always thought, more aware than she let on. She called me from her car. She said, "He's drinking. He's been drinking since Tuesday." Then she said, "Is it true?" I said, "Which part?" She said, "All of it." I said, "Yes, Marjorie, all of it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I wondered." About the Audi. He told me he leased it for our son. I wondered why we'd needed to lease it through. Well, never mind. I wondered. I said, "Marjorie, I want you to know something. The deal I've offered him is private. It doesn't have to become public. It doesn't have to involve the police if he signs by Friday. But if you and I are going to be in the same family for the rest of our lives, which we are because we share a granddaughter, then I need you to understand something. I won't be told quiet little stories at family dinners ever again. Do you understand me?" she said. "Yes," I said. "Good. Come for tea next week. Bring her her cardigan, the green one. She loves it." She started crying. Then she said, "I will." Howard signed the paperwork on Friday afternoon. He brought it to my house himself, which surprised me, although it shouldn't have, because he is a man who needs to look the other party in the eye to feel like he's not losing. He was thinner than I remembered. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too big for him. He sat at my kitchen table. the same kitchen table where my daughter had cried, and he signed every page where I'd put a tab. When he was done, he looked up at me. He said, "Why didn't you ever say?" I said, "Why didn't you ever ask?" He didn't have an answer. He stood up. He went to the door. He turned around and he said, "She's a good girl, you know. Your daughter. She didn't deserve any of this." I said, "No, she didn't." He nodded. He left. My daughter moved back into 47 Linden Crescent the following Tuesday. Her husband had been escorted out by then by a lawyer Howard had hired with the contents of a single suitcase. He's living, I understand, in a rental apartment in AX. He sees the baby on alternate Saturdays, supervised at a family center until the separation agreement is finalized. He's been very quiet, my daughter tells me. Very ashamed. I don't know if the shame will hold. I'm not betting on it, but for now, it is what it is. My daughter is back at work, although not at the firm. She took a position with a competitor, a larger engineering firm with offices in Markham, at a salary roughly 30% higher than what Howard had been paying her. She is taking night classes towards her project management professional designation. She is, slowly, becoming the woman I always knew she could be. The woman who would not have called me from a gas station if she'd known 3 years ago what she knows now. The credit accounts have been expunged. Howard paid off the balances in full, and the bureaus, after a great deal of paperwork, cleared her file. Her credit score is now better than it has been in 5 years. The Audi has been returned to the dealership. I do not know what happened to it after that, and I do not care. Marjorie comes for tea every other Thursday. We don't talk about Howard. We talk about the baby who is walking now, properly walking, and who has begun to say a word that sounds like Nana and which she points at me when she says it. I keep the signed documents in a file in my basement. I do not expect to need them again. But I am a careful woman. I have always been a careful woman. It is the habit of a lifetime, and I will not be giving it up. Last weekend, my granddaughter was here for the afternoon while her mother went to a class. We were on the living room floor with a set of wooden blocks I'd bought at a shop on Queen Street. She was stacking them. She would build a tower 3 or 4 blocks high, and then she would knock it over with her hand and laugh. Then she would look at me expectantly, and I would help her start the tower again. We did this for almost an hour. At one point, I built the tower for her, 6 blocks high, and she just stared at it. She didn't knock it over. She looked at me. She looked at me. She looked at the tower. She looked at me again. And then, very carefully, very deliberately, she reached out with one finger and pushed the bottom block. The whole tower came down. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud, alone in my house with my granddaughter, because of course she had figured it out. Of course she had. That's what we do, the women in my family. We look at the tower and we look for the bottom block, and we wait until the moment is right and then we push. She is 14 months old. God help anyone who tries to lock her out of a house. I picked her up. I held her on my hip. I carried her to the window so we could watch the rain on the maples, the last of the leaves coming down, the season turning the way it always does. I said her name. She said something back that wasn't quite a word, but that was meant for me. And I thought, as I have thought every day for the past 40 years, since my own daughter was small, that the deepest thing in the world is not power or money or revenge. The deepest thing in the world is roots. You don't always see them. You don't always see them. You don't always need to. But when the wind comes, they're what holds you. They're what holds the women you love. They're what makes sure that when somebody changes the locks, somebody else, somewhere quiet, owns the building. She fell asleep against my shoulder. I stood there at the window for a long time. The rain kept coming. The kettle in the kitchen started to sing. I was home. I have thought about that night a great many times since. The rain on the highway. The pink rubber sole of my granddaughter's shoe poking out of the car seat. The way my daughter said, "Mom," and then nothing, because she had nothing left. What I keep coming back to is this. Howard did not lose his empire because I was cleverer than he was. He lost it because for 30 years he had been a man who never asked. He never asked what I did for a living. He never asked who his daughter-in-law really was. He never asked who his daughter-in-law really was. He never asked his wife what she'd noticed. He never read the documents he signed. He moved through the world believing that the people around him were furniture, and furniture eventually lets you down because furniture has been watching you the whole time. That is the first thing I would want a younger woman to take from my story. Be the one who asks. Be the one who reads. Be the one who does the quiet, boring work of understanding the paper your name is on. My daughter did not know, at 29, what was in her own credit file. Most women I know don't. We are taught to be trusting in small domestic ways that cost us very dearly in the rooms where the real decisions get made. I want that to change for her daughter. I want it to change for yours. The second thing is harder to say plainly. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not raise its voice at family dinners. It does not buy a Mercedes to be seen in. It does not need to be called the head of anything. It simply, quietly builds, year after year, document by document. It learns the rules of the country it lives in, the corporate law, the family law, the tax code, and it uses those rules the way Howard never bothered to. That strength is available to any woman who decides she wants it. It is not glamorous. It does not feel like power most of the time. It feels like paperwork at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. But when the wind comes, and the wind always comes, it is the thing that holds. The third thing is the one I would want my granddaughter to know when she is old enough. You can be kind. You can be patient. You can love generously and forgive often. None of that requires you to be unprepared. Being prepared is not the opposite of being good. It is, in fact, what makes goodness durable. A woman who has done her homework can afford to be gentle because she does not need to be afraid. Howard lost his empire because he sowed contempt and harvested contempt. Marjorie kept her dignity because, at the last moment, she chose honesty. My daughter has her home, her child, and her work because I had spent 31 years quietly making sure she would. None of this was magic. It was cause. It was effect. It was roots. That is what I have. That is what I am leaving her.